Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
My name is Sean Berry, and I'm a partner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Garrett Neiman. Garrett Neiman is a serial nonprofit entrepreneur with a focus on social justice. Neiman was the founding CEO of College Spring, a national college access nonprofit that was recognized by the Obama White House. He was also a co-creator of Liberation Ventures, a philanthropic fund focused on building power towards federal reparations. Currently, he serves as the senior fellow at Prosperity Now. Welcome, Garrett.
Thank you, Sean. I'm glad to be here.
Great to have you with us today. And I'd love to start by hearing about your background and how did you get into the work that you're doing today?
Absolutely. That for me, I really have to go all the way back to my childhood, but I'll be brief. That I grew up in Orange County, California, a white, affluent, pretty conservative suburb. And one of the ways that my life was really shaped was my younger brother died in an accident. I was 6, he was 2.5, completely turned my family's whole life upside down. And I think that's really what led me to a social change orientation. I just always had this sense growing up that life was fragile and wanted to live a meaningful life and always prioritized mission-driven work. That meant volunteering growing up. And then when I went to college at Stanford, really got recruited into what some people call the nonprofit industrial complex and basically spent 10 years in education reform that led me to have a desire to address issues more systemically.
Sorry to hear about the loss of your brother, but I also realize how that deeply impacted you, right? Because life is precious and we have this one beautiful life. And so what can you do about it, right? To maybe filling in some blanks, but like not only to live fully, but to create benefit, right?
Oh, I was absolutely through my nonprofit work, I met a lot of philanthropists who seemed to have that realization later in life that until they were 40, 50, 60, they were solely focused on making money and supporting their family. It isn't until something significant happens later in life that leads to some sort of shift around purpose. For me, that happened at 6 years old.
So, and then you said led to getting involved in education reform. So connect the dots between education reform, College Spring, Liberation Ventures, and then of course we want to hear about, you wrote a book, right? So we want to hear about your book that you're releasing.
Yeah, so I started College Spring while I was an undergraduate at Stanford with Jessica Perez. The two of us got that off the ground from our dorm room, and I ended up leading College Spring as the founding CEO for almost 10 years and built it into a small national organization, $4 million budget, raised $15 million, staff across 3 offices, serving 5,000 students annually. And, on the one hand, it was this major success, and it continues to be a success. So the organization is still running under my successor, Dr. Yoon Choi, today. But on the other hand, I think I also, through that experience, really had my eyes opened in terms of how deep the systemic inequalities are and really developed a curiosity and hunger to address issues more systemically. That I was very aware that the students we were serving a tiny slice of the students who needed those services, and we were providing a tiny slice of what those students needed when they were up against not having healthcare, not having food for school, not having parents around, all of these different challenges. And then alongside that, I was encountering a lot of philanthropist bias. I had all of these strange experiences where one moment I would be in a high poverty school within a community of color, and then my next meeting would be in a corner office somewhere, and I would get served fancy executive lunches that people brought to us in the office, those kinds of experiences. And there really was just a huge disconnect between those two communities. And I heard a lot of ignorant things in those offices, sometimes some overtly bigoted things. And what really led me down a path of noticing that if there's bias at the top in terms of who controls the resources and fundamentally makes the big decisions about where resources go, that bias is going to be present through the entire sector. And eventually I started to see too how that some of that bias unconsciously lived within me and shaped how I was wielding power within my own organization. So all of that led me to take a really big step back and kind of look at social change from a new lens. It was really that work that led me to Liberation Ventures, which is focused on building power within grassroots Black-led organizations to further the U.S. reparations movement. And my most recent work is writing a book that came out on June 20th called Rich White Men, What It Takes to Uproot the Old Boys Club and Transform America, which is really looking at this question of what is the role of advantaged and powerful people in creating social change. That I now am quite skeptical of the model that I had been taught at Stanford, which is white guys start things and lead things, but also there is a role for us in the work. So that's really what the last decade for me has been about, and a lot of what I cover in the book.
Awesome. Thanks for that arc. And yeah, I want to hear more about it. First, I want to ask you this question, and I imagine you have considered it, but you're an advantaged white man, right? You're kind of at the top of the stack, right? With myself included. What's your stake in this work? Like, why? You maybe have your needs met, right? So why do you want to kind of maybe risk making other people uncomfortable, kind of rock the boat, kind of try to change up the power structure here? So there must be something that's calling you forward. What would you say your stake is?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's an important question. And I think when I first got into equity issues, broadly speaking, 15 years ago, that I think I really didn't see much of a stake in it for me personally, that I thought the world was unfair and unjust and wanted to help. Some would call that a white savior lens. That wasn't the intention, but I definitely feel like some of those characteristics, were animating me in terms of what brought me into the work initially and motivated me to do that work. But I think as I've gone deeper and deeper into it, I've started to find my own stake in it, as you were alluding to, and in particular, this notion that even for those who are advantaged, highly advantaged in our society, like white men in wealthy families are, that the system doesn't work perfectly for us, that my material needs are met. But if we look at self-interest more broadly than just the material piece, which is something I'm really trying to emphasize in the book, there's ways that, for me, for example, assimilating into whiteness led me to be disconnected from my Jewish heritage, from my grandparents' ancestry. So I've been reconnecting with that's been an important piece of this journey for me, that, as I've gone deeper into anti-sexism and feminism, that I've gained access to emotions that frankly I didn't have a lot of access to, that being able to say, I feel sad, I feel scared, and hearing people validate that. And on the class side, I think there's something about how money really separates us from other people, and that I had this tendency growing up to try to solve problems with money. And I now am much more intentional about trying to solve problems through relationships and the support of those relationships. So I'm finding all of these different ways that living in kind of an alternative reality is a way for me to actually have my needs met much better than they would be otherwise. So material needs, yes, but I do think that our system doesn't meet anybody's full set of needs all that well.
Yes, thanks for your articulation around that. I definitely relate, right? That's maybe a critique of our society in large being kind of materially wealthy, but spiritually and relationally impoverished. And as humans, that's essential. And so I think it's important critique to say, hey, there's a high degree of concentration of wealth, but it doesn't equate to wellness, right? And health and happiness.
Yeah, and absolutely. Just to build on that a little bit, I think when you share that, what it reminds me of is the first time I went to Israel as a Jewish American who was born in the United States, that there's all these stereotypes, like white people can't dance or Jewish people in America can't dance. And I accepted some of those stereotypes growing up. And then I went to Israel. People were going out and dancing and having a good time, just like many other cultures, so it really is there are unique characteristics of white American culture. And when we assimilate into that, there's things that we lose. And it has its material advantages and so forth for those who can assimilate into whiteness, but there's definitely a cost. And that cost is more and more present for me the deeper I go into this work.
So do you self-identify as being able to dance?
I'm getting there. I'm more comfortable than I was.
All right, Garrett, let's go dancing sometime. I'm going to dance with you.
Sounds good.
And important, right, to break down those stereotypes and say, bullshit, I'm going to dance right now. And I have feelings, right? I have feelings and I have needs, and I'm a man. right? And they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a health and wellness that you're alluding to that's deeper by being able to reclaim those, and we can't just reclaim them for ourselves. They belong to everybody, right?
100%.
Awesome. The title of your book, Rich White Men: What It Takes to Uproot the Old Boys Club and Transform America. I'm loving it. It's just kind of like music to me to see the title.
That's good. Not everybody feels that way, so I'm happy to hear you say that.
You're in the right place here. So how does the Old Boys Club reproduce itself, right? So kind of like, what's the problem statement, right? Where we're at, and then we can maybe touch on what are some of the solutions and actions we can take.
Absolutely. So what you alluded to, that how the Old Boys Club reproduces itself, that's the title of part 1 of the book. It's a 2-part book where the first is more problems oriented and then the second part is more solutions oriented. And when I think about how the Old Boys Club reproduces itself, the idea I anchor on in the book is a term that I coined called compounding unearned advantage, which is a different way of talking about privilege. It's, in many ways, you could argue it's the same concept, but a different way of thinking about it and talking about it. That privilege, as you know, a lot of people bristle at, don't identify with, struggle to hear. Unearned advantage is a little bit more neutral, has a little bit less baggage. And compounding unearned advantage is the idea that those unearned advantages, when they show up at key moments in people's lives, they have compound effects. So I give the example in the book of how when I was in 2nd grade, I took the GATE exam to determine if I would be in the gifted and talented program. And I actually didn't get the required test scores that were necessary to be labeled gifted, but there was a district workaround where a teacher could submit a portfolio on your behalf and the district would determine whether you were labeled gifted that way. And my teacher decided to put my hat in the ring for that, and I was accepted and labeled gifted. And that's what put me on the path to AP courses in Stanford and everything that came after it. You know, when I was a little kid, I just thought it was that I was gifted and it was just correcting some sort of wrong or unfairness. But I think the reality is that there's also ways that my identity characteristics played into that there's studies that show that white teachers believe their white students are higher potential. There's studies that show that parents Google more often, is my son gifted than is my daughter gifted, speaking to some of those gender biases. Obviously, teachers in affluent communities have more free time to invest in their students. Parents from wealthy families have more time to invest in and advocate for their children. You know, so there's all of these seemingly subtle ways that these biases show up, but when they show up at a key moment in our lives, they can put us on a completely different trajectory. And in America, where there's such a winner-take-all economy that you get into the best university, the best job, and that leads to all of these, quote, riches, that it really doesn't take that extreme or overt of discrimination to generate those compound effects. So that's really how I frame the issues in the book, is that this notion that the bias doesn't have to be extreme or even overt to generate massive disparities. And so if we want to take on those disparities, then it really requires massive solutions to combat those compound effects.
So let me make sure I have the phrase right. Compounding
unearned advantage.
Compounding unearned advantage. Right. And so it's not just one unearned advantage, but they're stacking up, right, to give this head start. Privilege, you said, some folks are bristling at that. So different way to describe that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and we see it in organizations too, as kind of another lens of this idea that, like, if someone is in an organization where white men are promoted at slightly higher rates, even slightly higher rates than white women and people of color, and that keeps happening, that there's another round of promotions, and each time it's a little bit more likely that the white men are going to be promoted. At the end of all that, you end up with a structure where the people at the top are almost exclusively white men. So that's another way those compound effects play out, that if people are being, having the opportunity to be or be not promoted 10 times in their career, it doesn't require a massive bias to produce a massive disparity across a lifetime.
What do you think holds white men back from being involved with a movement for racial justice or collective liberation?
It's a really tough, complicated question to answer. And I also really believe strongly that white men are not a monolith in this, that certainly our class background factors in, other identity markers factor in, and so forth. some of the patterns that I've seen, that I think there's a lot of it is, I think, purely ignorance. America is arguably more economically and racially segregated than it's ever been, or certainly has been in a long time. That a lot of the wealthy white men I know basically just go from bubble to bubble, that they grew up in a affluent white neighborhood, they go to private schools that have the same demographics, their colleges have the same demographics, their investment bank or consulting firm or tech company has the same demographics more or less. And so there's kind of mild breaking out of those bubbles, but for people to really build meaningful differences across race, across class, even across gender in ways that identify those systemic realities doesn't typically happen. So part of why I introduced the compounding under an advantage concept is to try to help folks who understand really well how compound interest works, how those advantages show up in their lives, that there's a disconnect there that we're trying to close. And I really do think that it's really important that for white men to be engaged in the work, that we really do need to believe that discrimination explains disparities, because if we don't, if we think it's because of genetic differences or behavioral differences or cultural differences, then we're not really going to be motivated to address those issues. And there's really no way to measure whether we're making progress toward those issues. So that's part of it, I think, is just to break down the ignorance and have relationships across differences and frameworks and analysis that helps people understand. But also, there's still a big gap between awareness and action, that I think there's a lot of fear for white men about engaging in the work. And I've definitely had a number of experiences where I've messed up, gotten critical feedback. Sometimes that critical feedback has been public. And there's such a strong culture in this country of not, at this point, about not wanting to, quote, be labeled racist or misogynistic or whatever it may be, which is, it's a good thing to a degree, but I think it also leads people to be, from privileged places, to be very fearful about speaking up. A lot of what I advise people on who are early on in their journey is just this notion of just really jumping into it and taking small kind of baby steps, seeing how those land, and then take bigger and bigger steps as you grow your confidence that you're able to contribute to equity issues in a positive way.
So jump in, get involved. Don't necessarily wait till you're like some idea of like a perfectly evolved racial justice advocate, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not possible to be a perfect racial justice advocate. And the folks who talk about white supremacy culture, like, they include perfectionism as one of those things. So, like, ironically, like, trying to be a perfect racial justice person is actually, as I understand it, advancing white supremacy culture. So, but there really is a polarity here around, I think there's a tendency for white folks, white men in particular, to jump in really fast and kind of like go, take on more than they can chew or that they're equipped to handle, move fast and break things kind of orientation. But then there's also the flip side, is this paralysis, like analysis paralysis, don't do anything orientation. So I think a lot of the work for me has been trying to figure out how to live in this messy middle where I'm not causing a bunch of damage or harm, but also I'm not doing nothing. And if I'm in that messy middle, I'm going to make mistakes. I have to accept that imperfection along the journey.
So, Garrett, do you have a story that you're willing to share that wouldn't be too vulnerable? But this is kind of the essence and what we try to feature on our podcast of Next Economy Now, of like, these things are actually happening now. And so like the real kind of lived experiences, I think, are so valuable, right? Rather than like a theoretical example. So if you're up to it, I'd love to hear a story to share with folks.
Yeah, so I want to speak a little bit about mistakes generally, and then I'll give you a specific example. But in Rich White Men, I talk about mistake after mistake that I made, and I really tried to write the book in a way that demonstrates that this is lifelong work that I'm in the middle of wrestling with and figuring it out. It's not written as, oh, I worked on this for a long time and now I have all the answers. It's very much written as, this is an active struggle for me, and here's what I think I've learned, here's what people have told me, here's mistakes I've made, and so forth. And I think that learning orientation is really, really important for privileged folks who are doing equity work. And so there's so many different mistakes I could point to. I think the one that immediately comes to mind is that I remember when I was first starting to really be activated by these issues in a deep way in the 2016, 17, 18, 19 period, that I was super loud, dominating conversations, really trying to like raise the flag that I cared about these issues, trying to perform that I cared about these issues, trying to, with the sense that it was like, oh, well, like people like me need to speak up. So I'm going to do that. And one time this hit home for me was that I had a classmate in grad school who cursed me out in front of 140 classmates, woman of color, who basically gave me a hard time about, wait, like you say that you're all about these social justice issues and then that you're not giving other people an equal chance to speak. And it was really that, tough critical feedback that was hard to process in the moment, but I was later able to get through that. I think helped me see that I think one of the ways that white men, myself included, often struggle in these issues is just not sharing the airtime. That I think that's one of the number one things that drives white women and people of color crazy about white men, is that we just feel entitled to dominate the conversations. And it really is our ability to speak and the different ways we combine and use language that makes us uniquely human. So that if I am really going to believe that other people's humanity is equal in value to mine, I have to value their voice equally. And if I'm talking more than my share, then I'm not doing that. Like, that's one example of a lesson I think was really hard to learn. But once I learned it, really unlocked a lot of opportunities in terms of building more meaningful relationships across differences.
Thanks for sharing that, Garrett. And yeah, I can relate, as I've had some similar experiences. And I would also share of just the learning has been, at least for me, and I imagine you might have some similar experience of how rich and wonderful everybody else's lived experience also is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really unlocks a lot, or it has unlocked a lot for me as I've gotten to really become interested in everybody's lived experience in a much more deeper way. And I really try to hold the orientation that every single person on this planet has a unique story, a unique lived experience, unique wisdom that only they hold. And so I found that when I approach people from that lens, I'm really able to see just the wonderful diversity and beauty of our shared humanity in ways that I didn't previously when I was taking that less seriously.
Absolutely. Here's an idea. Tell me how this lands with you. Have you heard the language of othering and belonging? There's a institute right out of California, Berkeley, and that's always just been a powerful framing for me. How does that land for you or relate to your work here?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I talk about othering and belonging and John Powell's Institute in the book. And part of why I do that is I really do think it's an important concept, that belonging is a very fundamental human need, that we saw this in the COVID pandemic, that if you don't have access to fellow humans, life is a whole lot harder. And so having access to other human beings, feeling belonging in those spaces is really a fundamental aspect of what makes us human. And when I think about belonging, the thing that comes to mind first for me is that a few years ago, Harvard did its first pulse study on belonging. And basically what it showed two things I thought were important. So one is that the level of belonging that people feel varies by identity. So, white men feel the most belonging, white women feel less belonging, people of color, women of color feel even less. If you have other marginalized identities, like if you're differently abled, sexual orientation, whatever, maybe all of those things cut into belonging. So that's one part. But also the other part is that at Harvard, at least, only, I think it was something like 13% of the students said they felt like they strongly belonged. Some said, a lot more said somewhat, but most of the students said, I don't feel like I strongly belong here. And that includes a lot of white men and wealthy white men. So there's something missing in our community dynamics, even within privileged people and privileged spaces. So I think there's something about what are the needs of ours that are not being met by the dominant culture, and how can we reimagine those spaces to deliver belonging for everybody? And, I mentioned earlier that certainly the advantages I have in society make it easier for me to feel belonging in certain ways, that I think, it's easier for me to feel belonging if I have food in my stomach than if I haven't eaten all day, for example. But also there's ways that the current system comes up short for all of us. And so I really try to lift up this notion that we really do need to transform our system, that it's not about kind of flipping the hierarchy or things like that. We really do need to imagine something that's very much different. And part of that reimagination is, as uncomfortable as it can be to say in certain spaces to not demonize rich white men. The issue as I see it is not so much rich white men, but more concentrated wealth and power, and that's a long time issue in this country, but it also predates the construct of a rich white man, that this goes back even further in a bunch of different ways. And so there's a tendency sort of in the Western world, Christian world norm of like good versus bad, that either you're a hero or a villain. And I think what I try to lift up in the book is this notion that all of us have a lot of complexity. All of us are socialized uniquely based on where we're situated. And it's about all of us, particularly the most advantaged among us, doing a little bit better. And if we do that, we really can move the needle.
Yeah, thanks for that, Garrett. I really appreciate that orientation, because especially like what you said about it's not exactly rich white men that are a problem, it's the concentrated wealth and power that they hold. And then that's different than the individual being a good or bad person, right? And so it's something that we can actually come up with solutions about. And we can look at, like, part of our conversation is like, hey, this isn't meeting everybody's needs. So how could we meet everybody's needs without shaming or blaming or a person being bad? But so to me, it's more of like, yeah, it's an approach of how do we work together without alienating people, because we're all bringing something important and valuable. It's a constructive, right, connected approach rather than we're the good people and we're fighting against those other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it makes me think of like building bridges, right, across some of these differences. Do you have any stories or examples of kind of building bridges across what might seem like other groups?
I'm going to start with two examples of bridging to white men who have different viewpoints. But if you want me to broaden to different types of bridging, I'm happy to do that as well. But the two I wanted to mention first, so one is, in 2019, I wrote an article in the Boston Globe about white privilege. And there was a white man who grew up in poverty, intergenerational poverty in Boston, who read the article, was angry about it because he felt like white privilege wasn't something in his life, given the intergenerational poverty of his Irish American family. And so he cursed me out and told me how I was making the country worse and all these different things. And at first, I was just going to archive it. I had gotten advice of like, oh, if you're writing on controversial issues, like, don't feed the trolls, like, just, you're going to get stuff like this. I thought about it a little bit longer and got this sense that I was like, wow, this is not actually somebody who's a troll. This is somebody who's very angry. And underneath that anger is a lot of pain about what his family has experienced. And so I ended up writing him back and basically used a framework that someone in social justice had taught me around supporting folks and challenging them. So essentially what I did is I validated his experiences, that he was very angry about wealth inequality. And I told him how I thought that was unfair, how my family I personally had benefited from intergenerational wealth in ways that I didn't earn and so forth. And that he was totally right, that we needed to have lower wealth inequality in our country. And then but also that when it comes to intergenerational wealth, that it doesn't guarantee that you're rich if you're white, but if you're rich in this country, you're probably white because of our history and the different ways that shows up. And he actually wrote me back and apologized and said that he really appreciated it. And he said that, okay, I see that, the white privilege is really like about a stain of our past and how it shapes basically what the elite looks like in our country. And so we were able to have this dialogue where once I actually listened to the pain he was experiencing, he was willing to be more open-minded on issues of race. And I think this is a very common thing where if you're talking about wealthy white women or wealthy black men or white men in poverty or any groups that have these sort of mixed identities where some are advantaged and some are marginalized, that we really need to take those systems of oppression seriously, all of them seriously, and validate that and fight against that if we want to build collective will for specific pieces like racial justice or gender justice.
Thanks for sharing that. So validating, kind of affirming where people are at, what they're experiencing, and then creating that connection and openness, right, to then maybe share or expand the thinking.
I think it really is the case that if I make a sincere effort to really value somebody's humanity, it's going to be a very different conversation that I don't do that. That my experience is like people can tell if my eyes are kind of glazed over, or I'm not really listening. Like, people can feel that, particularly across differences, because less wealthy white men, white women, people of color are so used to wealthy white men treating them in some version of a disrespectful or dismissive way. So if you are a white guy who doesn't do that, who like really looks people in the eye and really takes in what they have to say, their lived experience, their pain, and so forth, that it opens up a lot of opportunities for dialogue that wouldn't be there otherwise.
Absolutely. So one of the groups you mentioned in the book is White Men for Racial Justice. It's a group that I'm a part of and I'm really, really benefiting by. And one of the things that came up in that group is they put us into smaller peer circles. So it's a group of 5 or 6 guys where you keep meeting with the same guys rather than the big group is like 400 people or something. They said, okay, get in your peer group and then name your peer group, but the request is to name your peer group after a white man who is a mentor for living into racial justice. And that was hard. That was hard for me and our group. We eventually did some research and found some names, but I just I had nothing to say when I was first asked that question. So can I ask you that question?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really happy that you brought this up. I mean, first of all, I'm appreciative of White Men for Racial Justice, which is one of the few communities that has been able to successfully motivate white men to engage more deeply in racial justice issues. And I found circles, affinity caucus-based circles, to be really valuable for opening up new kinds of dialogue. And it's funny that you ended up doing that exercise, because it really is the case that it's not just the history of the oppressed that's erased. It's also the history of privileged people who were part of the resistance who are erased too. And, so when I think of an example, I mean, the one that probably most inspires me is Stanley Levinson, he was Dr. King's closest white friend. Almost always when I bring him up, people haven't heard of him, which is a remarkable thing, because he was literally Dr. King's closest white friend and confidant, as I understand it. And he was a partner to King. He helped write speeches. He helped raise money for the movement. He helped hire staff. So in many ways, he brought, many of these quote white man skills, like the experience of building institutions from a place of power. But he did so in a way that was collaborative and really saw King as an equal, and also in ways that centered King's leadership. So I think about how philanthropists often engage, there's often this oh, we're going to put all these strings and restrictions and you're going to do what we say sort of orientation. That was not Levinson's orientation. I thought of him much more as kind of like a committed spouse who was just kind of in it for life along King's side, and they were just figuring it out together. And there's this lovely story of how King would write speeches and then Levinson would edit them based on what he thought might resonate better with the white population. But then if King disagreed because he thought Levinson was watering it down or changing the message or something, he would revert back to where he was and Levinson would stand down. So it was really this collaborative co-creation exercise, and the two of them were able to write speeches together that I think reached the American public much more effectively than either of them could have done on their own. That's one of the reasons why the civil rights movement had the success that it did. I really try to lift up this notion of, what does it look like to take some risks, to really be in it as a lifelong partner across differences, contribute your skills and wisdom, but do so in a way that's humble and not arrogant.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm one of those Americans that ignorant of Stanley Levinson. So now I have a new piece of research to do. So thank you for that. Can we talk about the 10 actions the advantage can take to help construct an equitable America? All right. So you do, the first half of the book is about the problem statement, but then you get into, and so, I guess I'm curious of how you develop those, if you want to maybe talk about some of them.
Yeah. So as you're pointing out in Rich White Men, in the appendix or back matter of the book, there's a list of 10 actions the advantage can take to help build an equitable America. And I won't list all of them here, but I think what I would emphasize is that I think there's this notion that I have that is, what is our unique role in the work? What is the work that we can uniquely contribute to? And in a lot of cases, I think that's bridge building work. So what does it look like if we're in rooms that other people aren't in, whether it's with our family, our friends, and institutions, what are the places where we have unique influence, and what are steps we can take to activate that sphere of influence intentionally, and what does it look like to be influential in this work? So for me, it's really important that I recognize with a project like this book, for example, so the book that's an element of my sphere of influence. I feel confident it's going to reach some folks, move the needle to some degree, but also it's not going to reach everybody. It's not going to change everything by itself. So what does it look like for me to be both ambitious about who I can potentially influence, but also humble about the fact that I really need to collaborate and see this as an ecosystem of a whole bunch of folks who are each doing their small part to make things work, I think is a really important lens to this. And I think I found that having community of people who are going through a similar process and struggle is really important. So I really would lift up groups like White Men for Racial Justice, or Organizing White Men for Collective Liberation, or Breaking the Mold, or any of a number of other initiatives, Showing Up for Racial Justice for White Folks, Solidaire for Donors. There's all these communities out there where you can meet like-minded people who are grappling with similar challenges from a similar position and location in society. So I think for me, having that community support has been invaluable, and it helps me show up better in my equity work, but also just living an equitable life, being connected to other men who are trying to have 50-50 marriages with their spouse. That's been really helpful to me to hear how guys are wrestling with that. And sometimes it's even sharing frustrations about it, like that, hey, there's certain things that, an equal society requires that we put up with that our dads didn't have to. It's totally fine to have those feelings, but also it's important to have the support to work through them so that we stay on this path of centering equity instead of just giving up and reverting back to old habits.
Can you comment on the actions? I guess there could be a way of taking it of hey, I just need to do some of these things and then it'll be better, versus one thing I heard you say in this conversation was this is an active struggle. And another thing I've heard it described is it needs to be a lifestyle, right? As kind of a way of life versus one thing you do. I'm curious to hear you speak on that.
Yeah, I think there's no one size fits all here, and a lot of it I think has to do with the particularities of your situation. Do you have access to a bunch of wealth or not? That question is going to really impact the ways that you're involved and engaged. Or have you saved enough for your retirement, or are you not there? And how did you come up with what number is enough for you? And is that a number that is sustainable for our country and planet? And could you have a different number? And what does that look like? So there's so many different ways that this could go. I think for me, what's been important is realizing that in order to be a quote expert on these issues, that we have a really strange view of what that means from the typical white American and white man perspective. I think there's this tendency of oh, I read this one book, or oh, I have one friend from this background, or whatever it may be, and that means I know all I need to know. I really anchor on Malcolm Gladwell's, you have to put in 10,000 hours so you really know something. And even then, there's still work to go, I'm sure. But that's something that I often raise with white folks and white men in particular is have you put in your 10,000 hours yet? And most of the time the response I get is, oh, I've read a couple books, talked to a few people, and that's about it. And not that everybody has to dedicate their entire life in that way, but I think for those who really want to make this a lifestyle, thinking about that degree of investment, I think is actually what's required to move the needle.
It's a long haul, right?
It's a long haul. But it's also super rewarding. Just that along the way, feeling like I'm contributing to our society becoming more equitable, feeling like I have really deep, meaningful relationships across differences, feeling, those many moments where I surprise people by being different than what they expect from a white guy. That there's challenges too, but there's a whole lot in this that's super rewarding. And even for me with my spouse, which is, across gender and race and culture, that I think our relationship is so much stronger because of the equity journey that I've been on. And there's so many different ways that this shows up and enriches my life on a daily basis and longer term.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. Yeah, that kind of points to, I guess, how I see this is for it to be a lifestyle, it has to fulfill you, right? It has to sustain your life. So there has to be joy and mutual benefit. And yeah, that's kind of what I opened with is like, what's your stake, right? And so this doesn't feel like a martyrdom, kind of like, oh, well, I'm doing this service because it's the right thing. It's actually wonderful also.
Yeah, I mean, and the martyrdom's really dangerous. Like, I think I had fallen into that at different points in the past. Like, there's a very fine line between being a champion for equity and being self-hating. That I think there's a lot of folks who, part of beating up on white people, for example, is also about beating up on themselves. And so what does it look like for us to really feel good about ourselves and what we have to contribute, and to also be committed to building equitable America? That I think it's challenging to have both. That it's this weird thing where I have to reckon with that I'm really not as special as I was led to believe growing up, that a lot of it had to do with compounding unearned advantages. But that also doesn't mean that I have to be self-hating or unconfident or never speak or anything else. Like that I can feel good about what I have to contribute and go out and try to do that.
Thanks, Garrett. What question do you not get asked, but that you wish you did get asked?
Yeah, it's a good one. I'm happy this is part of this. I think one of the questions I think is super interesting is like, what is the connection between rich white men going to therapy, psychological therapy, and social justice? And, it's something that no one in my family had ever gone to therapy. So I was the first in my family to really give it a shot in 2018. And it's on and off. It's been an important part of my life ever since. And one of the things that I realized after my brother passed away is that I have a lot of anxiety historically. And, officially since 2018, but I think unofficially since my brother died, that I had this vigilance around the world that showed up in every interaction to some degree. And as I started doing more work across differences, I found that a common and unhealthy coping mechanism for anxiety is that you want certainty and control. And if you're a white man doing social justice work and you're engaging in a way that is demanding certainty and control, you're not gonna get along with folks across differences. Clearly, that's not how I wanted to show up. It really was through doing this work across differences where I had to come up with healthier ways of dealing with my anxiety. When I was CEO of a nonprofit, I would just, and it was a pretty typical top-down nonprofit, I would just tell people what to do and ask them to do things that were on topics that were stressing me out and things like that. And I know there were times that people didn't like it and it was stressful for them and so forth, and I kind of just did it anyway. But it really wasn't until I was in this different setting where I was trying to share power that I was really pushed to face my anxiety. And that has been so transformative for my life that I am a whole lot less anxious now. I'm much more self-confident, but also I'm able to work much more effectively across differences. And so there's something interesting about this notion that I think a lot of people think that all wealthy white men are just thriving. There's a lot of pain and stress and anxiety and depression within the wealthy white men community. And so if we work through that, it's going to make our lives better, but also it's going to make a difference for those who we have power over and interact with on a day-to-day basis.
I love it, Garrett. Again, this theme of like, it's not just something you're doing for other people, but you're actually enriching your own life, your own experience.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that, lifting that up. And I actually strongly identify because I was introduced to psychotherapy about 20 years ago, and I'm very happy to be transparent that I've been in and still in psychotherapy since then. I find it really supportive, but it was also introduced to me at the same time as kind of racial justice, privilege, and doing this type of work. So I do see those complementing each other. So thanks for sharing that. What do you need right now? How could our listeners support your work?
There's really two parts here. I think one is that certainly we want folks to read Rich White Men. That we have my author website is garrettneiman.com, GarrettNeiman.com, which includes ways to order the book and learn more about the book and so forth. And we hope it's helpful for wealthy white men who are trying to engage more equitably, but we also hope it's supportive for less wealthy white men, white women, and people of color who are trying to influence the wealthy white men in their lives. So that's certainly one piece of it. I think a second piece is that we really see this much more as a campaign than only a book. So we're trying to be really intentional about organizing wealthy white folks and rich white men in particular into social justice movements and have partnerships with a whole bunch of organizations that we can steer folks to. So for wealthy white folks, wealthy white men who are listening, that I hope you'll contact us directly, that we'll have a one-on-one call with anybody who fills out that request. And then also, if you're a less wealthy white man, white woman, or people of color who wants to nominate a wealthy white man to engage with us for whatever reason, please do that as well, and we'll reach out to them. So those are the two main ways to connect.
Awesome. I love it. Any parting thoughts for our listeners?
I think one thing that comes to mind that just we didn't have a chance to discuss yet is that the accountability piece is really important for a project like this, that writing a book is an exercise of power, and at least in my case where it was done with a mainstream for-profit publisher, it's also a commercial enterprise. So one of the things that we did that I'm really proud of is that we restructured what would have been my author royalties as a royalties cooperative. So I co-created the cooperative with Alan Kwabata Frimpong, who's a movement philanthropy strategist that we've done various work together over the years. So we designed the cooperative. We invited 6 social justice partners into the cooperative. So those 6 individuals and organizations are receiving 6/7, so 86% of the royalties in exchange for serving as accountability partners for the project. It's a way of embedding equity into the economic and governance structure up front, so that in the event that this book sells a lot of copies or has a significant impact on people's lives, that there's equity mechanisms built into it. It's a concept called pre-distribution that a Yale professor came up with. It hasn't got a lot of traction yet that we're hoping to spread. So he talked about the new economy already being here, but just for not in every space yet, that this is an example of something that we hope can be part of this new economy.
Oh, thanks, Garrett. I love it because pre-distribution, right? You preempt the potential counterintuitive that you could be like getting rich off of this this book.
Yeah, I mean, no accountability system's perfect. I'm sure people will innovate on top of this too, but it's a start toward doing some things differently.
Wonderful. Well, Garrett, thank you so much for being with us, and best of luck with your good work, and we'll certainly be keeping up with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate the time.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.